was just telling you just now some of the.
Okay. Okay, now we're live streaming, so we have to be on our best behavior, right, comrade?
Okay, yeah.
Yes, comrade.
You're starting.
Yeah.
Marcello has vanished.
Just telling you just now some of the.
Okay.
Yes, sir, we are going live.
So we have to be on our best behavior, right, comrade?
Yeah. So 10 to 15 minutes for me, he says. You're starting.
Yeah.
Marcello has vanished.
Yes, sir.
Sorry, did you hear that the sound is coming back?
Welcome, friends.
Yeah. So 10 to 15 minutes for me, he says. You're starting.
Yep. Welcome you all on behalf of Manchi Pustakam. Most of the people are joining for the first time, so let me. May I request all other? May I request all other speakers, except the 3 speakers on the panel? May I request all others to mute their mics? Yeah. May I request all other speakers, except the may I request all others to mute their mics? Yes, friends, sorry for the disturbance. Welcome to Manchi Pustakam. It's a small YouTube channel. Basically, aiming at dedicated discussions on the selected books, which are of contemporary. Welcome to Manchi Pustakam. It's a small YouTube channel. Contemporary Indian relevance as well as global importance. So far, we have introduced about 100 books. The last one being selected Ho Chi Minh by author himself, who is our panelist, comrade Vijay Prashad. And next day after tomorrow, we are coming up with another book called Ancient India. This is day after tomorrow, as the culture of contradictions. Professor Upinder Singh from Ashoka University will be presenting her views on that. She is the author. We are a small group of people who came across various intellectuals and their writings. We thought of introducing those writings and the books to the particularly Telugu audience, along with those who are interested in following our channel. Today we are going to discuss about the last years of Karl Marx, a very, very important contribution by Marcello Musto. I think he is with us now.
Yes, I am. Good afternoon, good evening, everybody.
Good evening. Good evening. He is working as a professor sociology, University of Toronto, and he brought out very sizable. He has contributed in a sizable manner in revisiting the Marx, basing on the information or the research that's going on happening in Amsterdam-based International Institute of Historical Research. And in this book, he, as we all knew about something about Marx being a straightforward intellectual thinking, being always surrounded by books and the revolutionaries and revolutionary discussions. Along with that aspect of Marx, in this book, what I found is human Marx, the human side of Marx and his jovialness, his chit-chatting with his kids, grandchildren when they are moving out of London to France, how he felt, all these details along, and also this particular book deals about the last 10 years of, as far as I could make out, last 10 years of Karl Marx intellectual journey, because we are given a kind of impression that he could not complete his volume 2 and 3 of Capital because of his sickness, long illness, and that's why Engels has to step into his shoes to complete these two books. That was the impression given to us till now. So, but the latest research and information that's coming out of the various research institutions and also the contributions informs us that he has not kept him idle because as a sick man, he took up the new tasks where he found important information that's coming up on various aspects, either by research or by political developments or by economic developments. He studied all that information to bridge the important gaps in his theory of historical materialism, so that the theory can be spread forward and backward relations in societies. Particularly the notes he made about 4,000 pages, that was what we are coming to know. In the last 10 years, he generated notes of 4,000 pages. These 4,000 pages, they are under decoding now, I believe. Some of the volumes have come out in the name of ethnological notebooks, and some like Evan Anderson's Marx on the Margins. So all this information will help us to revisit Marx and apply it to him to the current condition. With this hope, I requested Professor Marcello to present his views on this book. And I request Comrade Sitaram Yechuri to start with his opening remarks. Comrade Sitaram Yechuri, for those who are not familiar with, Comrade Sitaram Yechuri is the General Secretary of CPIM, Communist Party of India Marxist, two-term parliamentarian, and kind of what it may be not an occasion to say, but he is one of the few individuals who are struggling to keep kind of working as a keepers of the Indian conscience, Indian conscience of the Indian Republic. So I welcome Comrade Sitaram Yechuri.
Thank you very much. So should I begin?
Yeah. Yes. Yes.
Hello, Professor Marcello Musto and Professor Vijay Prashad. I find myself very inadequate in the midst of your company to talk about theoretical contributions of Marx, though we are practicing Marxists. So we try to imbibe as much of this theory as possible and keep pace with whatever new things that are emerging of his writings and his work. But first of all, I'd like to thank Manamanchi Pustakam for initiating this discussion and giving me this opportunity, particularly on the birthday of Karl Marx. So that is an important add-on occasion that we are discussing this book today. I think one important aspect that this book and work has done, I mean, it's been widely translated into many languages, and I'm glad one of the earliest of the translations was in Tamil in India. And it actually brings forth the assumption that most of us had, not really an assumption, but a general confidence that Marx would never have kept quiet, not doing anything till the last minute of his breath, of his life, which is exactly what this book shows us, and particularly the richness of his work. And that richness of his work, which is general misnomer, was that because of the ill health, because of the family problems, because of his penury and poverty, I mean, he just stopped writing or thinking or being creative, which is absolutely incorrect, which has been shown by this work. There's a wealth of analysis in much of what has come out. Much of this work is still being published, and we hope that the mega project will continue to do this to the best of their ability, which they are of course doing. And I'm so glad that Marcello Musto has actually studied and put out, particularly the last 2 years of his work between 1881 and 83. Yes, there are newer areas that have been described here, which are not, in my opinion, essentially new in the sense that the seeds of most of these areas were already there in the earlier works of Karl Marx. Whether it's on the question of environmental damage, what Marx used to describe as the pillage of nature, or whether it's an issue of migration of labor or the workforce, which was connected with his entire conception of the reserve army of labor and how that is generally created. So all these issues are more elaborated, which is of particular significance, and particularly for us in India. Of significance are his new writings, which are now coming to the fore on anthropology, on ethnological notebooks, which some of which we'd had the opportunity to study in the past, but I think a lot of fresh material is now available. And of course, his views on nationalism, which is something which is absolutely relevant to us in our day-to-day battles in India, on the question of how nationalism is utilized, or how, in popular international terminology, which I don't think is strictly scientific, but what is called as populist nationalism. But these phenomenon, which explains also the political rightward shift that is taking place in the world in the current conjuncture of global capitalism, under the domination of international finance capital and the neoliberal order. In this conjuncture, the entire question of populist nationalism and how this rightward shift is actually seeking to disrupt the unity of the revolutionary forces in order to mount an offensive against the rule of capital. These are all something very, very relevant to the present revolutionary praxis that is going on in many countries and is of absolute relevance to us today. So these aspects will have to be studied further in order to enrich revolutionary praxis. And it is with that objective in mind that these new information on what all Marx thought and created and wrote in the later years of his life actually proves the point which Marcello Musto says very, very categorically, that it is entirely non-dogmatic, non-schematic, and therefore it represents a completely opposite view of the effort to try and reduce Marxism to a set of formulae or to a set of dogmatic propositions. On behalf of the CPIM, all that I can say is that our party, CPIM, was born out of a fierce ideological struggles on many issues, including this particular one on how we understand Marxism. We have always understood, and we've always stated in our documents, that Marxism is not a dogma, but a creative science. It is based, among others, on a concrete analysis of concrete conditions. Marxism is an approach to the analysis of history, in general, and of capitalism in particular. It is on this basis, building on the foundation provided by Marx, that we continuously enrich our theory for understanding the present conjuncture and the possibilities it holds for the future. Far from being a closed theoretical system, Marxism, as far as the CPI is concerned, represents a process of continuous theoretical enrichment. That's why we firmly believe that Marxism is unique in the sense that it can be transcended only if its agenda is realized, and the agenda of realizing a classless communist social order. Specifically under capitalism, its understanding of capitalism is alone thorough enough for it to comprehend the historical possibilities that lie beyond capitalism. Hence, Marxism can never be, under capitalism, rendered superfluous until capitalism is itself superseded. Post-capitalism, Marx's philosophy and worldview will continue to the basis for scientific guides, for social construction, and the transition to communism. But having said this, which is in a nutshell the understanding that the CPM continues to function with, it is also important to make sure that we don't fall into the trap of drawing conclusions of who made what mistakes in the past, and why these mistakes were committed. And that analysis, though relevant, though maybe enriching, and is of importance to not to fall into those traps and to repeat those mistakes. But it is nevertheless to be, I think, underlined that Marxism's conception post-capitalism is an uncharted territory. It was an uncharted path with no blueprints, no thing, and including Marx himself, talking of the various possibilities of how this transition, it actually, it will reflect itself once this transition takes place. Because if you, all of us know and all of us recollect that in the final pages of volume 1 of Capital, when in that very small but excellent chapter on the historical tendency of capital accumulation, Marx comes to this conclusion, which is central, in my opinion, to this entire understanding of Marxism, that the very process and the laws of dynamics of capitalism lead to a situation where, I quote, centralization of the means of production and socialization of labor at last reach a point where they become incompatible with their capitalist integument. This integument is burst asunder. The knell of capitalist private property sounds. The expropriators are expropriated, unquote. Now the question that arises is, since there's no blueprints, since there's no chartered path, how is this expropriation of the expropriators to be followed upon? What comes after? Is it a natural process? And if it is a natural process, then how will this occur? Because Marx himself tells you, once this tendency is noted under capitalism, every tendency, right from his first pamphlet on wages, prices, and profit, where he takes on a gentleman called John Webber, when his tendency for the suppression of wages and the immiserization of the people is known, people start getting organized in order to resist that, and that is what begins the beginnings of collective bargaining and the trade union movement. The tendency for the falling rate of profit is met by the capitalists by changes in the organic composition of capital. So the tendencies under Marxism that Marx notes are tendencies on which the contending classes also react and respond and counteract. The tendency for this integument to be broken is there. The capitalist class would seek to intervene to try and prevent this from happening. If not prevent, at least prolong it from happening. And in this process, how is it that this the ending of capitalism and the beginnings of a post-capitalist society towards communism that Marx envisages, how will that begin? Yes, many experiments were made, many references are there to the Soviet experiment. The Paris Commune, in fact, precedes that experiment, that experience, 70 years of the Soviet Union, that experience, and how that was, many of us, we were born out of a fight against the of the CPSU those days in the 1960s. So we have all gone through these experiments, but I think we cannot negate the reality that this process, what Marx talks about, the inevitability of the collapse of capitalism. It's wrong to say Marx doesn't have any concept of inevitability. He does in the Communist Manifesto. He's very clear in the Communist Manifesto where it says, what the bourgeoisie therefore produces above all is its own grave diggers. Its fall and the victory of the proletariat are equally inevitable. Unquote. This is the Communist Manifesto. So that inevitability, how does it get realized? What is the process? Yes, in that, many such experiments have taken place. Currently, another one is going on in the Socialist Republic of China. How that will happen? It will consolidate Marxism, but does that mean that the richness of Marxism and Marx's contributions and his analysis is being robbed? On the contrary, I think the essential point is what Marx taught all of us, have told all of us. The philosophers so far have hitherto only interpreted the world. The point is to change it. If you have to change this world, then the assault on the rule of capital has to be mounted. If that assault on the rule of capital has to be mounted, and Marx himself is clear in many of his earlier writings, that capitalism and its tendency towards a crisis, every crisis is a potential revolutionary conjecture, but no crisis by itself will lead to the automatic collapse of capitalism. Capitalism will have to be overthrown because it is the theater of contending. And in that theater of contending classes, the assault, class assault against the rule of capital has to be mounted. And that would mean on the basis of a political alternative. Now, the experiments with these various political alternatives have occurred. They will occur in the future as well. But for that, to enrich ourselves, not to either repeat the mistakes of the past or to traverse the same ground, it is necessary that all these creative inputs that are now becoming available are properly assimilated, analyzed, and enrich the revolutionary theory. Because without revolutionary theory, there can be no revolutionary praxis. And in that process, I think this is a contribution that is that is very, very useful, Marcello Musto's contribution, and I hope that there'll be more future works that will be done on the more future information that will be available, because Marcello himself states in his introduction, I think in the early stages of the book, I quote, you see, that is why I say that it is to try and understand the concrete conditions in which people were trying to understand and implement or give their understanding of Marxism, which could be inadequate, it could be distorted, but it was definitely, nevertheless, an attempt to try and construct a political alternative to capitalism, which failed. Some have failed, some are continuing, some are going on. How that will end up, etc. This is the battle of class forces that will eventually unfold. But Marcello himself notes at one point of time, and I quote, "In best of circumstances, it is difficult to combine the requirements of popularization with the need to avoid theoretical impoverishment." Unquote. Yes, the point is the purity of theory, or as Marx said, the point is to change the world, to implement that theory in praxis, in order to advance the revolutionary struggle. And in that process, we learn from our mistakes, because as both Marx and Engels have taught us, committing mistakes is not the mistake. Not recognizing the mistake is the mistake. And not ensuring the mistake is not repeated is the mistake. And that is what I think, with all these new theoretical inputs that we are finding from the later years of Marx's life, and particularly the ethnological notebooks, which I was referring to, which has a lot of importance for us in India, and to understand both the Indian society, the anthropological works that have now come to the surface, and also his observations on nationalism. These are of absolute relevance even for our present day work in India. Therefore, I think this is a very important contribution. And thank you, Marcello Musto, for bringing all these works of Marx to public knowledge and to enriching our understanding. And hopefully, practicing Marxists and revolutionaries will make use of this work in order to enrich Marxist theory, in order to improve Marxist praxis and revolutionary praxis. And I think to that end, I would say seriously recommend that this book must be read, discussed, understood, and wait for the new work that will come as assured in this book of the later findings that will now be printed by the maker on the other areas that were mentioned in this work. So thank you once again, and I recommend that all of us seriously study these works of Karl Marx that have now come to light. Thank you. Thank you very much, Vijay.
Thank you, Comrade Setram Garu. Well, rightly said, there is a re-evaluate and revisit again and again about to Karl Marx's original writings, so that we understand what exactly he meant when he is writing something, instead of going through interpretations, third interpretation, second interpretations. So in that manner, in that sense, it will be interesting to visit the last year's works particularly, and the new volumes that are coming out by commenting on, basing on the last year's contributions. Now I request Professor Marcello to take the floor, and it's very important day for him, for the Manch Post to come, and also he has some plans to, as I was discussing with him over repeated emails, he has some plans to study the left movement in India, and particularly in this part of the country. So he had some propositions and also some ideas to engage with the Indian audience. So this may be the first of its kind of interaction for you, Marcello, with the Indian audience.
Well, first of all, thank you very much for the invitation. Thanks to Veraya, for Srinivasu, for the perfect organizing that they did. And it's a pleasure to be with my colleagues, discussant, and comrades, most of all, Sitaram Yechuri and Vijay Prashad. No, I've been to India many times. Actually, the first travel that I've done in my life as a young student and activist was in India. I spent more than 2.5 years, and then I returned in India many times for political activity, academic presentations. And as it has been said so generously by Comrade Yechuri, and this is a particular pleasure for me, this book, and not only this one, has been widely translated into many Indian languages, in Tamil, in Hindu, in Bengali. There are other forthcoming translations. So it is very important for me that Marx is read in the Global South, particularly this one. And I very much share the idea that actually these questions that usually are ignored issues or underestimated topics in Marx are actually very relevant for us today, and perhaps the most important for our political agenda today. But I'm going to talk about this at the end of my short contribution. Since the introduction has been so good, and I'm sure that Vijay Prashad is also talking about this topic, I would like to do something that perhaps is a little bit surprising for you, but I would like to take a little bit of time not to speak about the last Marx, but to speak about what Marx existed before the last Marx, the last years, so that we can explain if and where there were some differences. And also today is a special day, it's his birthday, his anniversary. So I will try to do a very quick, fast, and of course, please forgive me, superficial reconstruction of Marx's intellectual biography. So the Marx that we always have in mind, we often have in mind, is this big statue, this granitic statue that is, I don't know, at the center of a square of, it was in Moscow, in Beijing, or in many other countries. But actually, Marx is a student like many of us. When he was young and he went to the university, he was a very brilliant, of course, student, but also a person who was going to do, I don't know, going out with friends, doing sometimes rivalry, and sometimes he also had a fight with the colleague, and luckily he did not lose one of his eyes. So for Marx's father, was very difficult to make sure that his strength, his energy was put in the right place. And the first years of university for Marx, I'm talking about the late 30s and the beginning of 1840s, were very important for Marx. So he produced many interesting things, he wrote many things. He was actually perhaps the most brilliant interpreters of Hegel. But what I want to say to the audience, and this is a characteristic of Marx's life, and this is connected with the last years of Karl Marx, he never published something unless he was absolutely sure that he was going to be right, or that he had all the information about the topic, that he read all the books about that topic. So starting from this period, the late 30s, when Marx was only 20 in 1838, he started to write his first notebook. And this is something that Marx did until the very end of his life, until 1882. Taking notes in its notebooks. Now we have more than 200 huge notebooks, and the Marx Engels Gesamtausgabe, this new critical historical edition, is publishing these notebooks sometimes, actually very, very often for the first time. So what are these notebooks? These notebooks is like Marx is going to make photocopies of his book, but since he did not have the machine, he's taking notes of the most important parts, and then what he's doing sometimes is making comments with the most relevant, parts. He's taking excerpts, he's making his notes. Sometimes he's criticizing, sometimes he's completing what in the book was not good enough for him. So one reason why many biographers of Marx has wrongly believed that this author had done very little, if not nothing, in the last decade of his life, is that Marx, it is true, did not publish very much, but Marx wrote many, many notebooks. And in these notebooks, in these notes, there is the continuation of his research, of his investigation. Very important point to take. But this is something that is true also for his young when he was young, at the beginning of his academic life, in the so-called early writings, because if we talk about the most famous books of Marx, or some of the most famous books of Marx, then we have to acknowledge the fact that they were not published by Marx. And I want to call the attention of the audience of this point. There is a list of books of Marx published by Marx, and also important writings. Among them, there is the Communist Manifesto, there is the Civil War in France, written after the Paris Commune in 1871, there is Capital Volume 1, 1867, and there are a few other books that actually Marx published in his life, but that they were not very important for the Marxist debate or in the academia in the 20th century. For example, if I mention The Holy Family, The Poverty of Philosophy, the speech on the question of the free trade, or even this work on the history of diplomacy that Marx published in 1857, well, these are books that have been discussed much, much less than incomplete and sometimes fragmentary manuscript left by Marx and published by others. For example, the Economic Philosophical Manuscript of 1844, this was not published by Marx. Why? Because Marx wanted to complete his investigation and never had the time to do this. But this is the most sold book of Marx, the most discussed book of Marx, not a book, as I told you, in philosophy. And the German ideology, written by Marx and Engels in 1845-46, this is very, very well known. It's perhaps the cornerstone of dialectical materialism in Soviet Union, but this is not a book published by Marx and Engels. And actually today, thanks to the new investigations, we know that the idea that they had was to write a project with many other scholars criticizing all the interpreters of Hegel, the left Hegelian, because they were not anti-capitalist. And there are many other books that I can mention that we consider books, but that actually books were not. The Grundrisse, for example, the first draft of Marx's Capital, written in 1857-88. The second and the third volume of Capital, these are very well known because they were published by Engels. The Critique of the Gotha Program, the thesis of Feuerbach that has been quoted so far. So there are many fragmentary documents and manuscripts and texts that were not published by Marx because he was not convinced that he reached the final stage of his research and he wanted to study more and more. This is very relevant for us, and this is an important thing to understand when, until a certain point, we have all these books on Marx, introduction on Marx, intellectual biography of Marx, where there is so much written about the young Marx, so much written about 1848, but then there are some periods, sometimes also decades, where Marx was, practically ignored by these biographers. And this is something that we can also see with recent books published. There is too much attention to the 1840s, and there is not enough attention to the 1850s and the 1870s and 80s, of course, the last 3 years that are at the center of my book. Let me focus on the 50s for one moment, and then I will go to the main topic of our discussion today. What happened to Marx in 1850s? We always have this idea that Marx is the leader, followed by the masses, etc. Well, actually, Marx had important political experiences in the 1848, 1849, when he decided to be a journalist in 1843, 44, a short but brilliant career in Germany, but then a long and important career in the United States, because Marx was the main correspondent for the New York Daily Tribune from 1851 to 1862, and he wrote more than 550 articles, often with the help of Engels. Well, in this period, Marx is, of course, engaging politics and sometimes also practically, like in 1848. But of course, the most important experience, and as you see, I'm trying to give biographical information, political information about his life in all the decades, the most important experience was the one that Marx did between 1864 and 1872 in the First International, in the International Working Men Association, very important for Marx. At the time when Marx was struggling to finish Capital, considering that the first draft was written, the Grundrisse, in 1857, and it took 10 years to Marx to publish the only volume that he could finish, volume 1, in 1867. So actually Engels was scared about Marx being involved in politics because everybody wanted Marx to concentrate on Capital and finish his masterpiece. But Marx understood that International was actually a very relevant experience, and being at the core, at the center of this International, of this organization, would have had serious repercussion on what kind of socialism was going to be the most relevant socialism in Europe at the time. And he was right, because Marx was able to fight and win the battle, the struggle with Proudhon in France, with the very moderate policy of trade union in United Kingdom, with Lassalle in Germany, and then, of course, in many other countries. But let me talk about Russia later at the very end of this. So what happened to Marx in the 1850s? I was mentioning this to you. Well, Marx in the 1850s is completely isolated. He is in London, living in dramatic circumstances, poverty, illness, at the center of Soho, which at the time was one of the poorest districts in London. And Marx is actually refusing the idea that the 1848-49 revolution was lost because of a lack of organization. Many leaders thought about this. Actually, Marx isolated himself because he wanted to focus on political economy, and he studied more and more. So this decade, from 1849 to 1857, when Marx started to write the Grundrisse after the first world economic and financial crisis, the one that erupted in New York, like the one that we lived a few years ago in 2008, well, this is an important point for Marx. And in this moment, like in the 1870s, in the 1880s, so at the end of his life, and I'm going to go to this topic now, Marx is not publishing books. Well, he's actually writing many articles, many newspaper articles in the New York Daily Tribune, as I told you before, but mostly because Marx was poor and he needed this $2 per article in order to buy potatoes for his family and survive, always with the generous help of Engels. But Marx is doing many research, many investigation, taking these notes in his notebooks, and this is very important for us. So today, when we approach Marx with the new edition and with the new investigation that we are trying to do, the new edition of his writings, we are going to read not only the books that he published or the manuscript, uncompleted manuscript published by people like Engels, like Kautsky. Kautsky published, for example, with many mistakes, by the way, the theory of surplus value. Today, we can also write the notebooks of Marx. And what is more interesting for me, following also the political considerations that we were debating at the beginning of this talk, is that we can read not only the answers provided by Karl Marx. It is beautiful because we can also read the questions that Marx posed at the time, posed to himself. Marx was a very critical author, a very self-critical author, so full of doubts. He decided not to publish something until he was sure that he was right, and rewriting the text many times. It is, for example, for this reason that in 1869, when Marx should have focused on Capital Volume 2, he decided to study Russian and to read and learn Russian. This was his 8th language. Marx could read in 8 languages. Engels could do even more, 12. So why Marx is doing this? Marx is doing this, and this is very connected with the last years of Karl Marx, and I'm going to focus on this topic from now on. Marx is convinced that his analysis of capitalism, more than ever, even more than before, because Marx never wanted to focus his book only on the analysis of England or of Europe. Marx is actually convinced that he should bring more countries in volume 2, volume 3, in the continuation of Capital, or actually also in the correction of some typos and mistakes that Marx was doing in volume 1. This year, there is an important anniversary for Marx scholars, the 150th anniversary of the publication of the French translation of volume 1 of Capital. This was a translation to which Marx participated himself, and Marx made some changes. We are debating this. I'm editing a new book of this, but this is just to show you that the idea of considering Marx a dogmatic author is wrong, because Marx himself was already trying to change, improve Capital just a few years after the publication of volume 1. And this is also connected to the question of inevitability of socialism, the inevitability of revolution that was mentioned before. And, you know, I always say that we should divide and make a distinction between the texts of political propaganda, and the Communist Manifesto, of course, is one of them, a text that you need to say people there will be revolution because you have to call the masses to political action, and then the research manuscript that Marx published, or also the text of economical analysis, in which Marx is much more cautious and doubtful, at least in terms of what is inevitable. And this is something that we find a lot in his last decade. So in his last decade, in my opinion, we find new disciplines and new areas in which Marx is going for the first time, or when Marx was able to spend more time, because at the end of his political activism, practically with the end of the First International, then there is a lot of activism that Marx is doing in order to give a revolutionary program to German social democracy, which is a battle that we know he lost, right? Because with the Gotha program, the program of Lassalle is still the most important one, and Marx is writing the critique of the Gotha program just to criticize this. But let's say that from 1875 to 1883, when he died, he had more time to study. He had the passion to study, as Comrade Yechuri told us at the beginning, always hungry about reading more, about taking notes, about expanding his knowledge. And this expansion is done from the point of view of disciplines. There is a lot of anthropology, ethnology. Marx is studying chemistry. Marx is studying history once again, because Marx is reading the history of the world and is making a 600 pages notes. Why Marx is doing this? By the way, when he's doing this, Marx is never thinking and working exclusively on Europe. India is one of the most cited country by Marx in these notes. It is very important, and Marx is studying India once again very seriously. So new disciplines, but also new areas, new geographical areas. India, Egypt, Algeria, Mexico, Indonesia, more. Why? Because Marx wants to understand the effect of capitalism. So all that Marx is doing in this period is part of his political activism. And when he's studying, what he's trying to do? Why is doing anthropology and why is studying history, or for example, Indian history? I try to explain in my book, after reading very carefully these notes, sometimes still unpublished notes, in this way. Anthropology. Marx wants to check history, wants to check his conception with history, and want to see what happened in the past. And Marx, from the very beginning of his life, is convinced that an essential element that we have to understand is that capitalism is historical and not natural. And Marx is trying to see what in the past made other forms of production change. And this is good epistemologically, but also politically, because people understand that capitalism didn't exist before and can be overcome today. That's why it is relevant to have Marx today, because with Marx, we have the guarantee that the word capitalism is still mentioned, because something crazy that is happening is that we cannot even mention the word capitalism sometimes. And the other things that Marx is doing, it is trying to bring new topics from a political point of view. And this is the case, for example, of India, when Marx is once again returning on the effect of capitalism. And Marx in 1853, when he's writing the famous article for the New York Tribune, The Future Result of the British Rule in India, I will never say that Marx was under illusion that capitalism is progressive, like many bad interpreters of Marx have written in the past. But surely Marx is more focused on the idea that capitalism is bringing the material conditions of the new world, as written in the articles. Now that Marx is reading Indian history again, now that Marx has new sources, well, Marx wrote that actually all the British managed to do was to ruin native agriculture and double the number and severity of famines. And he said, anyone except Harry Mayne and others of his ilk realizes that the suppression of communal land ownership there was nothing but an act of English vandalism, pushing the native people not forward, not forward, but backwards. This analysis on the effect of capitalism and colonialism in India can be found just the same against French in Algeria, against Spanish colonization in Mexico, against British in Egypt. So there is a very strong and consistent position of Marx. And this is why this reading of Marx being considered a white male in favor of colonialism that are so à la mode, in vogue today in North American university, are depressing academically and, ironically, politically. So what I'm trying to say in the last 2 minutes that I have to finish my speech is that these questions, these topics are very relevant for us. And I want to return on this subject ecology, migration, gender equality, no to nationalism, anti-colonialism. As it has been said by Comrade Yechuri, these are not often things that Marx mentioned for the first time here. No, so I am against this idea that there is a new Marx, that there is a break with everything that we knew before. This is a little bit too much for people to focus on their academic research. But it is true that Marx is looking at this topic now in depth, and is also taking new direction in this research, like, and this is my final point, about the idea of the revolution. And these changes are not only changes that Marx is doing like a scholar, but also as a political activist, because Marx is seen as a political activist at the head of the International, that the revolution is not coming from England, from the most developed, capitalistically developed country, or it is not automatic that is happening so. That's why Marx is now open, more open, to see what is happening in other parts of the world without dogmatism, without schematism. And this is why Marx considered the activism of Russian populism, populist. At the time, this word populism meant leftist, anti-capitalist, so it has nothing to do with the conception that we mentioned today. Well, Marx is looking at this as a possibility. Of course, a possibility that always must meet the anti-capitalist struggle that is done in the capitalistically developed country. So not only there, Marx is not coming back to an idea of communism like Herzen, like Bakunin. So capitalism is important because it has allowed many productive changes, and also in terms of emancipation, and also in terms of gender equality, etc., or the opposition to religion, etc. I cannot go into this, but it is very interesting to see how Marx is expanding his political scenario, the scenario of his analysis for the writing of Capital from the critique of capitalism, and at the same time also how Marx is more open to revolution to happen, to start, to move, to connect in other parts of the world and also in the global south. I know that we are in very difficult times, but this hope that Marx is doing, and a sentence that opened my book in the prelude of the book when a journalist is interviewing Marx, is very good and interesting for us. Marx was asked by Swinton for The Sun, the American newspaper, well, what is the essence of human beings? And Marx, look at the dark, they were in the south of England, but then turned to the journalist and said, struggle. Struggle is the essence of human beings. And I would say that this is still very important for us. And we can say, thanks and happy birthday, Karl Marx. Thank you.
Thank you, Marcello. You made valid points, and particularly you suggested to read through the Marx interconnectedly instead of parcelizing between young Marx, matured Marx, old Marx. You have to look at him interconnectedly so that we will get a better understanding of what he wrote and for what purpose he wrote. And also you brought out certain aspects of his choices of reading of various topics and subjects, all that has been placed at a proper level to reassess his theory of historical materialism and dialectical materialism, and also to reestablish the fact that, as you mentioned, capitalism is not a natural one, so it can stay long, it is kind of forever. It has to be changed, it can be changed. To establish that point, he brought out all the diversifications, new advancements of capitalism, so that he can reassert and explain his theory of socialist revolution. With these few remarks, I thank Professor Marcello once again. I hope he will occasionally give us time, particularly September 28th. That is the first founding day of first international. So I'm looking to have you on my channel again. Before inviting Professor Vijay Prasad. I have two questions for Comrade Sitaram Yechuri. Comrade Yechuri, can you unmute your mic?
Yes, yes, I'm happy to hear.
There's the two particular questions of Indian relevance. How to counter the Hindutva communal agenda of the fascist RSS, and it's also the second one is also related to the same theme: how to combat the right-wing forces promoting racism, xenophobia, religious sectarianism, fundamentalism, and parochialism, etc. globally.
Well, I think these are questions of revolutionary praxis at the moment. But nevertheless, since we are talking about Marx and his writings, and we are particularly talking about his writings on the ethnographic notebooks and anthropology and the other things and other issues connected, I think one elementary aspect must be kept in mind as an approach to an answer to these sort of questions. First of all, you see, Marxism is not to be reduced mechanically and erroneously to economic determinism. In fact, in a famous letter to Bloch, Engels explains what is Marxism, where he says the economic aspect of it, or the base superstructure relationship, the base is in the final analysis that determines it, but the superstructure elements continuously affect and in fact even decisively decide on the forms of struggle and the forms of revolutionary struggle that should take place. And why I'm mentioning this is that the ruling classes exercise their ruling leadership not through only one particular aspect, but it's an overall comprehensively done. It is they build up a class hegemony, something that Gramsci finally explains much more in much greater detail and with much greater clarity. It is the hegemony of the ruling classes that into which belongs also this element of Hindutva. Gramsci graphically tells all of us that it is not the fort or the fortress, which is the headquarters of the ruling classes, but there are many outer ditches, there are many rams, many earthworks that surround, and these values are transmitted to us, which Marx brings out in his anthropological and anthropological and ethnographic observation of how these permeate into the consciousness of people, and that meeting the consciousness of the people and how they influence to buttress the class rule. In German ideology, the Marx and Engels are very clear when they say the ruling classes rule not through the hegemony of, not, they don't use the word hegemony, but through the ideas of the ruling classes are the ideas of the Tikor. It is through these ideas, the set of ideas, which is the hegemony that is created. And it is that hegemony that has to be broken. Therefore, if that has to be broken, if Hindutva has to be combated, xenophobia and racism, if all these right-wing forces, which I refer to in a very passing manner, saying the political rightward shift, if these have to be combated, a counter-hegemony has to be prepared and counter-hegemony has to be realized and launched. And it is this counter-hegemony that has to be strengthened, which is essential part of Marxism, in my opinion. I mean, it is against the ruling class hegemony, you have to create a counter-hegemony, which, of course, Gramsci goes to the extent of also talking about the organic intellectuals as a part of this creating this counter-hegemony. So how do you combat it? Not through economic struggles alone. That is a very, very serious misconception, and it is in fact a diversion. You had this historic Kisan struggle in the country. You had this huge working class struggles that are going on against privatization and loot of the Indian economy. You have people struggling for employment against price rise, etc. And yet, Hindutva wins elections. Why? Why? Because it is this hegemony that is not being broken. And unless the communists, this is the revolutionary practice of Marxism, that you will have to build, along with sharpening your class struggles, along with sharpening of people's struggles, you have to sharpen the struggles for this counter-hegemony. And the struggles for this counter-hegemony have to be sharpened by taking on the agenda, all these aspects of the other aspects that Marx studied, while he requested Engels to prepare the other two volumes of Capital from his notes, when he was actually devoting time to study these various other aspects and bring his notebooks. It is these aspects that will have to be studied, which Gramsci, I think to a large extent, so whatever was available to him, I don't know what was available in Italian, Marcello would be able to tell me much more, but he nevertheless proceeded in that direction. So that is the manner in which this counter-hegemony will have to be built up to combat this thing. The other aspect also, which I will only take a few minutes, is the question of the adaptability of the ruling classes to the tendencies that Marx noted. For instance, today, in today's situation with the pandemic, with the global recession that set in before the pandemic, or the tendency towards the recession that set in before the pandemic, the slowdown, definitely economic slowdown. In that situation, neoliberalism has completely proven its bankruptcy in its inability to offer any solution for capitalism to emerge from this crisis. But nevertheless, the counter tendencies of what? Nevertheless, even during the pandemic, it designs your stimulus packages in such a way where the governments borrow through governmental bonds that are released in the stock markets to be sold. The stock markets get inflated and the world's billionaires start amassing their wealth. So even during the pandemic, the counter tendency of neoliberalism to maximize profits is visible in this manner, in which it has, in the name of serving people through stimulus packages, in the name of reviving the economy, it has actually provided and created a new route for greater profit maximization and amassing greater wealth by the world's rich and by the world's billionaires who have been making, whose wealth has been exponentially rising, and at the expense of the people's poor, and therefore intensification and exploitation, the hallmark of capitalism. So these are the tendencies that will have to be met squarely by the revolutionary movement. So I think this is a very challenging period we have before us, but all these aspects will have to be undertaken, and that is the only way to combat Hindutva or this rightward shift in politics, is to actually create this counter-hegemony that has to be created to the ruling class's hegemony. That is the way to combat that. Thank you.
Thank you, Comrade Ejuri Garu. The task before those who are working for an alternative society in the Indian context is to build a counter-hegemony and to work further, to strive further. Thank you very much for this. And now before inviting our regular guest, Comrade Vijay Prashad, let me announce that Marcello has agreed to give rights to translate this valuable book into Telugu. And we are going to do that very soon, by within a few months. Now I request Professor Vijay Prashad to reflect on the book, on the book, and also, yes, you are the person who Voice of the South, coordinating between the intercontinental activities, so that would shed some light. That would be helpful. In these lines.
Comrade, firstly, it's the old man's birthday today, so happy birthday to Karl Marx. 204 years old. That's a lot of years. He left us a long time ago. He left us a rich legacy. Obviously, we are not religious people, so we don't hurry to our Marx in order to get confirmation for our ideas. On the other hand, he is definitely an antidote to the feelings of desolation, because as I'm going to say, he was a fighting man, and that's itself quite inspirational. Thanks a lot to Mana Manchi Pustakam for again having me on. Glad to be here with Marcello, and congratulations on your book. It's great to be here with you. I want to also congratulate Comrade Sitaram for being re-elected as the General Secretary of the CPIM at the Party Congress. The antidote to the growth of virulent right-wing ideology and right-wing government in India, of course, is the left. And the growth of the communist left in India is really the only salvation for a civilization depressingly moving in a regressive way. Depressingly moving in a regressive way. I mean, the images one saw from Madhya Pradesh, Gujarat, and so on, of people virulently yelling down sites of Islamic belief and also Muslim neighborhoods is disgusting. It's not an India that any of us want. It reminds me of Ejaz Ahmed's comment about the cultures of cruelty. You know, when Ejaz said that in India we have incubated everyday forms of cruelty against women, against Dalits, against minorities of various kinds. And these everyday forms of cruelty, this culture of cruelty emerges in these horrible ways. Either it's pogroms or those really disgusting images of people behaving like that in public spaces. The communist left is the only antidote to that. And, we see that with the upstanding way in which the government of Kerala, for instance, shuts down this kind of behavior. I have to say that there are other governments that are also to be saluted for their position against this stuff, but this stuff is miserable. I was happy to hear Comrade Sitaram speak just now about how to fight the hegemony of these ruling class ideas. But I just want to underline that the salvation for our civilization is in the communist left. It's not going to come from anywhere else. This repulsiveness has to be fought and defeated. Well, I just want to make 3 points. First, because it's Marx's birthday, I want to just read out quickly the tribute Engels paid to Marx at his deathbed, just a little bit of it, because I think it's so beautiful. Engels was a dear friend of Marx. In 1859, when the preface, the contribution to political economy comes out, Engels writes, I think, 3 or 4 book reviews. He was such a dedicated friend. He loved his friend so much. In our tradition, I think we often don't talk enough about love and friendship and comradeship and the importance of building communities founded on something other than hate or self self-interest. We are not those who proclaim the inevitability of self-interest and talk about ideas like human nature being selfish and so on. Ours is a tradition of love and fellowship and comradeship, and there was no greater revolutionary friendship than between Freddie Engels and the old man. They loved each other. And so here's Engels at Marx's graveside. He said, "For Marx was before all else a revolutionist. His real mission in life was to contribute in one way or another to the overthrow of capitalist society and of the state institutions which it brought into being, to contribute to the liberation of the modern proletariat, which he was the first to make conscious of its own position and its needs, conscious of the conditions of its emancipation." And here's my favorite line coming up. But that sentence just now, that's a summary of Marx's career in a very balanced and just in a few words. But here comes my favorite sentence. Fighting was his element. When I first read this, I thought both about Marx's fighting in his texts against bourgeois thought, also fighting inside the First International to establish his position, and fighting as he ran down the street in London after another one of his drunken encounters in a pub. Pugnacious fighting against the creditors who were knocking at his door and so on. Engels writes, fighting was his element, and he fought with a passion, a tenacity, and a success such as few could rival. That's Engels at the death of Marx. Fighting was his element. That's the first point I want to make, is that right till the very end, Marx fought to establish the foundation for our tradition. And what is our tradition? And that's the second point. Our tradition is one of boundless Marxism. Ejaz Ahmed used to say all the time, he used to quote Jean-Paul Sartre and say that post-Marxism, Sartre didn't use the phrase post-Marxism, but Ejaz used to, post-Marxism is nothing other than pre-Marxism. That's what Ejaz used to say, paraphrasing Sartre. What he meant was that the so-called post-Marxist tradition essentially was a return to idealism, a departure from the materialist foundation set by Marx. But also, so-called post-Marxism produces itself through a caricature of Marx, a caricature of Marxism as well. As I said, ours is not a religion. Our tradition, the tradition of Marxism, is a tradition, as Sitaram pointed out earlier, which tracks the development of capitalism. And until we transcend capitalism, Marxism cannot be transcended, because it is the most accurate, and I deliberately use the word accurate, it is the most accurate critique of capitalism that we have at our disposal. If we had another tradition, we could, look at it, but we don't. This is an accurate assessment of the general tendencies in capitalism. Now, of course, there are enormous debates within boundless Marxism, and debate is a good thing. It's a rich thing. That's one way in which Marxism is boundless. It should incorporate the disputes within the tradition. That's important. It's also boundless in that it continues to learn from new developments. If it stops learning, it becomes rigid and loses its way. It must always learn. Reality is the school for Marxism. It's both a combination of reading our text, but also reading the world. Again, we are not a religious tradition. We don't go back to the Marxist corpus, Marx's own writings and so on, to validate how we see the world. Our text is reality, the contradictions in the world. We learn from the conceptual apparatus provided by Marx, but not always Marx's conclusions. Because after all, capitalism has changed quite dramatically in the period since the 1860s. Nonetheless, the conceptual apparatus remains absolutely essential. It's the way we interpret the world that has to be a part of our boundlessness. And now here, the way we interpret the world, at our institute, Tricontinental, we joke a lot about this 11th thesis on Feuerbach. Marcello talked already about the German ideology. Well, while putting it together, Marx made these notes on Feuerbach, which later were found and published as the theses on Feuerbach. It's pretty unfair to Marx, actually, because these may have been, kitchen table notes. It wasn't like he was writing theses on Feuerbach. He was putting some thoughts down. I've always found the 11th thesis to be quite inadequate. It's probably the best known of all the theses. It's where the philosophers have hitherto interpreted the world. The point, however, is to change it. I actually think that this is not correct. It's actually not a Marxist approach to thought. Marxism is much richer than what this thesis suggests. Why? Well, because it gives the assumption that philosophers who interpret the world are actually able to interpret the world. That is to say that having a detached attitude to the world does actually afford you a perspective of the world. Certainly affords you a perspective, but I don't think you can actually interpret the world from remove. I think if I could, if I'm allowed to revise the 11th thesis, the better 11th thesis would be those who are struggling to change the world have a better interpretation of the world. Because as you struggle to change the world, the contradictions in the world clarify themselves in a much more straightforward way. It's what Frantz Fanon said, that you confront the granite block when you're trying to change things. Idealistic liberal ideas are easy to have in a detached place, because you don't see that, for instance, the concept human rights is actually impossible in the world where people are hungry. How can you deliver human rights by legal fiat? You have to deliver human rights by material transformation. And so a lot of idealistic ideas can germinate, and you can interpret the world in those ways as well. Our tradition is boundless because it's always trying to see what are the material conditions of concepts, what are the material conditions of the realization of concepts in the world, and the block to that realization. That concepts, the existence of concepts themselves are not the completion of their history. Concepts complete their history when they are realized in the world. So, for instance, the idea of human rights is actually not realized in the world. They don't exist until we are able to transcend the obstinate facts of hunger, illiteracy, the lack of access to healthcare, the provision of housing, and so on. Otherwise, the concept itself is a vacuous concept. It's merely a concept that drives struggle, but does not itself exist in the world completely. The final point I want to make, and this comes a lot to the question of Marxism as a materialist approach to the world. You see, the reason we believe and the reason we struggle through and in this tradition is because we don't think that social transformation in the world is something that we have to impose into the world. That transformation comes from outside. In the German ideology, they note that in a sense, socialism is the real movement of history. And I've been very interested in that concept, that sentence, ever since I read it years ago in Calcutta, probably in one very hot summer. Read that sentence and thought, what do they mean when they say socialism is the real movement of history? It's a pretty captivating line, and I'm quite interested in what are the implications of it. So here are 3 points I'd like to make about the concept of, or at least the idea of the real movement of history. First, there are these very obstinate things, hunger, illiteracy, and so on. Hungry people are not willing to put their hands up to surrender. They are going to fight to overcome hunger. One sees that all over the world. No family is going to permit their children not to have education without a fight, without a struggle. Every historical epoch will have different obstinate facts, but in ours, hunger, illiteracy, the ones I've named, these are material forces that compel people into struggles. You don't actually need to impose struggle on people. They will struggle for these things. And as I say, every historical epoch will have different obstinate facts. Secondly, the massive advances in global production, this is in agriculture, this is in industry, and so on. These have enabled us to not only imagine a world that can transcend necessity and lead us to freedom. You don't just have to imagine it, but it actually is right there in front of us. We know that there's enough food, for instance, to feed 14 billion people. The planet has about 7.9. That means there's enough food in the world to feed people. That means the great material advances of our time has made it possible for us to imagine entering the realm of freedom out of necessity. If that is the case, what blocks it? And here, this is one of the great findings of Marx, which is the role of private property. There was a great piece recently in the Indian Express by Nirupama Subramaniam about the dairy industry in Sri Lanka, where she said, look, Sri Lanka is a net importer of milk. Some years ago, there was an attempt, Kurian and others attempted to actually establish a much more robust dairy production inside Sri Lanka, so that it was not importing particularly powdered milk into the country. And this attempt to create a domestic milk industry was blocked by the importers' lobby. So here you have private property essentially coming in to prevent the advance of society for its own narrow pecuniary interests. A good demonstration of a basic axiom of Marxism. So we have abundance, but we can't get there. And what blocks us from getting there is private property. Finally, the last point why our goals are actually materialist and not idealist. We're not trying to impose them into the world, but they emerge out of the real movement of history, is that we've seen over the course of the past 200 years the great socialization of labor. This socialization of labor, has enormous ramifications. But we're unable, in a sense, politically, to translate this socialization of labor into socialism. And that's our great task, is to think about the strategies in different societies to advance the socialist agenda. That's our big task. And that has been a task that every generation is given, to come up with more effective strategies, much more effective ways to intervene in the battle of ideas, much more effective ways to present to people the necessity of socialism. I would say that today the government of Kerala, for instance, is a standing image for the rest of India of what is possible with a rational socialist government, even in a position of great poverty, where redistribution of the surplus is the primary form of action. Even in that situation, it is able to make great advances. And I'm going to end by saying I highly recommend that people get the book by T.M. Thomas Isaac, former finance minister of Kerala. His most recent book from leftward is called Kerala. And it is an assessment of, yeah, there we go. Thanks, comrade. Another possible world. I think it's a really sharp book that will help young people come to understand the possibilities inherent in our world. We are not a tradition, an idealistic tradition that talks about, eventually tomorrow and so on. Our socialism is the socialism of now, and we're going to build the future now. We're not waiting for something later. And if you want to find evidence of the now, you can look to the cooperative movement in Kerala, the comunas in Venezuela. We can look to the level of public action in China, the level of public action in Vietnam. These are really instructive, and they'll help us understand that the real movement of history, in other words, the real movement of history, not towards merely advancing the productive forces, but the real movement of history to overcome or transcend the obstinate facts of human life, those are available today. They are visible today. And that's one of the great reasons why our boundless Marxist tradition is a materialist tradition rooted in the real movement of history and not in idealism, the fog of idealism. You want idealism? Go talk to people who believe that the market is going to save everything. They are the real idealists.
Thank you, comrade. A broad agenda back to the square one, where we are and what we have to do. Let me inform the audience that Comrade Vijay Prashad is recovering from COVID. Still, he found time, take out time to be part of this event. Thank you, Comrade Vijay.
No time, courage.
Courage and also pain, yeah. Thank you, friends. I think, Marcello, do you have time to take some questions from the audience?
Of course, always, so that we can also come back to Marx and finish with Marx, right? So I'm very open. Please.
Friends, now the floor is open. Who wants to ask Professor Marcello? They can write down in the chat box so that I can read out to him and he will respond. And meanwhile, he agreed to be a speaker on September 28th. That is the founding day of the First International. He will discuss, he wrote a book on the First International. So that book will be discussed on September 28th, and I hope a competent panel will be sitting along with him.
I think people is asking if they have to use the chat or if they come through the mic, and why not? Mic is open, right? So they can talk.
Yeah, that's okay. But if everyone starts the same time, that's the problem. That's why I suggested to use the chat box. And if somebody wants to ask directly, they can raise their hand so that we can unmute them.
Yeah. Perhaps we can authorize the first to use the microphone while the other are using the chat. What do you say?
Either way. Somebody, did Marx address the question of democracy in his late phase?
I'll take 2-3 questions together, and then of course not only me, right? For the 3 speakers, I guess. Do we go in the same order, or you just tell me?
Whatever that comes, we will first come, first serve. We'll go by that way. Instead of waiting.
Vijay, he also wants to ask a question because he said, I have a question, but
yes, I want to ask a question. This is with regard to the Marx Das Kapital. So after he wrote the Capital, did he review it and find out that of course, the inner mechanism of working of the capitalist system is okay, but still he find that there is a what he was expecting is the revolution should take place in the advanced capitalist country, but obviously the history says it is in the other way around. Did he think about that, and what is the theoretical basis for that? Did he do any homework on that part?
On where the revolution can start, right?
Yeah.
Thank you. There is also another question about the Philippines.
That's about Philippines.
Yeah.
You want to take the first 2 questions, then we'll see.
Yes. Who is going first? Me or
you?
Okay.
You are the guest, so.
Thank you. So I think you just have to unmute because I hear some echo. So the question of democracy, the question of revolution, the question of how can Philippine left consolidate their position following Marx's original prescription. Let's start from the last one. Marx wrote in many letters and documents that, as it has been said already before, he didn't want to give us solutions to apply to everywhere in the world. And this is, I will try to make now as many references as possible on the topic that we are discussing today, the last phase of Marx's intellectual and political biography. And this is very important at the end of his life, more than ever, I would say. The idea that many people are trying to take this theory, these ideas of Marx, and they try to stretch them too much. Marx doesn't like this. And it is in this context that he said, I'm not a Marxist. I'm not a Marxist because I don't want to be, and I am not in agreement with this idea that what I've written for a very specific condition, like, for example, England or Western Europe, can be applied everywhere in the world, all right? So if we reject Marx's prescription, if we reject, as has been said, this religious approach to Marx, then we can also see the importance of understanding why Marx is saying very, very carefully, particularly in the last decade of his life, we have to pay attention. We have to make sure that every country, every historical specificity, every economic social condition is treated in a different way. And this is true from the point of view of democracy and from the point of view of revolution, going back to the question that we received. I would just like to make one example that is another relevant topic going back to what Comrade Sitaram Yechuri was mentioning in the beginning, the question of not focusing our attention merely, exclusively on the conflict between capital and labor. It is, of course, very important, but it is not true that in Marxist tradition, we only look at this. So we have to go back in history and look critically what, for example, some parties have done. And I would like to take an example of Latin America in relation with indigenous people, right? In some countries, indigenous people produce food, build houses, clean the streets, but this kind of dogmatic approach made left occupied only exclusively with large-scale industry workers, but sometimes they didn't exist, right? So paying no attention to this ethnic identity, to these other questions that we discussed today, and this in India will be very relevant to the Dalit question, is something, for example, very relevant to renew our theoretic approach, to renew our political intervention. And the last Marx help us to go in this direction, a direction in which we do not consider only economy in this rigid way based on superstructure. It is in this way that Marx is returning on the question of democracy. And it is in another way that Marx is returning, and I finish here, on the question of revolution. This is the question received from Comrade Vijay. So Marx is interested in the populist approach, the populistic approach of the Russian groups, because he's looking at them and he says, well, these people are doing something. These people are trying to create a political intervention that is not simply a juxtaposition of what we have done in Europe and they put it in their context and it will not work, but they're trying to do something new. And Marx has seen also in Europe, because Marx, for example, is observing the Paris Commune, and at the beginning is skeptical about the idea that the revolution is coming. And perhaps Marx is right, because there were very difficult possibility that this revolution is going to win. But at the same time, history is not waiting. And at the same time, this idea that the class struggle should emancipate by itself, it is also what brings sometimes these riots, mass strikes, revolutions, etc. So I say that the help that Marx, and in particular the last Marx, is giving us is this one, making sure that we look at the entire historical specificity. And for example, I'm seeing now a question on Kowalewski. I'm leaving this to the other two speakers. But Kowalewski is very good in analyzing and criticizing the intervention of France in Algeria. I briefly mentioned this before, but Kowalewski is wrong if he believes that he can apply the categories of the understanding of Middle Age, of European feudalism, to Algeria or to India. Marx wrote this very clearly in these notes at the end of his life. Marx says, look, feudalism is something, and India and Algeria is something else. Let's not do this mistake. And this is useful, and this is, of course, very interesting for us as an activist, but also as scholars, right? Because I believe that Marx is a very good teacher, and the last Marx is a particularly very good teacher because he is, as I said at the beginning, he is hungry. He wants to learn more, and he wants to improve his theory until he had these last forces. Thank you.
Comrade Sitaram Garu, our party program says the stage of revolution is the people's democracy.
Yes.
And everyone knows basics about Marxism, says that Marx fought and theorized for proletarian dictatorship.
Yes.
From proletarian dictatorship to how to look at the perspective of Marx perspective on democracy.
Well, that's a very, very serious question. It requires a longish answer, actually. But let me try and summarize it for you. You see, when Marx and Engels were writing, and I agree with Marcello right now, you see, when he talks about saying that do not try and transpose what has been written by them or analyzed by them about one country, or even within one country, about one specific class, like the present war in Germany. I mean, you can't generalize it for the whole of Germany and for the bourgeoisie in Germany. But the question is that even in the Indian context, look at our experience of colonialism. Marcello was talking about Algeria and France. We've had French colonialism, Portuguese colonialism, and English colonialism. The entire historiography is entirely focused on English colonialism. And therefore, what the French meant, what the Portuguese meant, is back into the sideline. And I know now, because of the entire research that's been happening, and my daughter is involved in getting her PhD on this particular aspect, on the question of French colonialism in India and South Asia, and how different it was from the British colonialism. So generalizations of this nature is wrong. Exactly the same proposition applies to the question that you asked. Marx and Engels were talking in terms of, I quoted to you, on the historical tendency of capital accumulation, of saying that the emergence of monopoly capitalism will lead to a stage where the integument will burst asunder because it cannot contain the growth of the productive forces and the expropriation of the expropriator. That is in which stage? A stage of developed capitalism. When you have the concept of where imperialism developed beyond Marx's time, it's not that Marx did not anticipate something like that happening. He did. But the question is, what is the exact dynamics of that, etc., that came at a later point of time in history? When imperialism happened and when the whole world was bound with the imperialist chain, the possibilities of breaking imperialism at its weakest link arose. The question arose at that point of time. It is still a question that is still debated. You still have a movement which opposes that point, that whether we should break the imperialist chain at the weakest link or wait for the global revolution, the world revolution. I'm not getting into the labels of various, communist revolutionary movements and groupings. But the question is, when that happens, when the possibility of breaking the imperialist chain at the weakest link happens, then the question comes up that if the weakest link necessarily, according to Marx's own analysis, in my opinion, will always be the least developed of the capitalist countries. Russia was then, the various other factors with Russia, which Marx and Engels themselves point out, and Engels particularly in various prefaces to the Communist Manifesto after Marx's death, keeps on pointing out, and where it's now been merged, that the largest number of copies translated and sold of Marx's Capital and Marx's work were in Russian at that point in time, before the Russian Revolution. Well, these are different aspects of it. When that broke, the question is that it is not matured capitalism moving to socialism, but it is lesser developed capitalism, or in some places, semi-capitalism, semi-feudal societies. When they move, then you require to pass a stage through which you can prepare for the socialist revolution. And then the concept of stages of revolution came. So the question of stage of the revolution is important, because unless you complete certain tasks, like in India, you talked of the Indian state, unless you break the Indian dependence with imperialism, unless you break the Indian dependence with feudalism, the stage for a socialist revolution will not be set. But to break with imperialism and feudalism, you have to break also the link with the current Indian ruling classes led by the big bourgeoisie of India and the bourgeois landlord class alliance. So the anti-imperialist, anti-landlordism, anti-monopoly capitalism or big bourgeois capitalism, the leadership of the Indian ruling classes, these three tasks have to be completed before the stage for a socialist transition can begin in India. And that is where we talk of the People's Democratic Revolution. So this, I think, is this scientific, and that is the essence of Marxism, that you have to understand its essence, what I said at the opening remarks of mine, you have to understand that it is a creative science. What is said of one country is not applicable to the other. What is said of one situation is not applicable to the other. A concrete analysis of the concrete conditions. That is the living essence of dialectics. And that is where I think we'll have to understand the essence of Marxism. And that is why it cannot be transcended, Marxism. There's nothing called post-Marxism. There's nothing called, it cannot be transcended until the system that it is wanting to transcend, that is capitalism, is transcended. And even then, it'll have its influence left. So therefore, the stages come into the concept when capitalism itself evolves beyond what Marx talked of. And that is the integrant, instead of breaking asunder, the counter tendencies to that by the ruling capitalist class was the emergence of imperialism that was later noticed. And then therefore, the weakest link concept came. So therefore, I think this is how Marxism has to be enriched. And it's our task. Don't blame Marx. Don't blame Engels or anybody else. It is the task of our generation to actually enrich Marxism in our times. If you fail in doing that, Marx is not to be blamed.
Before asking for Comrade Vijay's response on Kowalski's references to India, one more question to you, Comrade Sitaram. Why Ambedkarites and one Mr. Gudipad Naresh, why Ambedkarites and Marxists are not working together in India?
Well, but it is not, as far as I am concerned, I can say very clearly, it's not the fault of the Marxists. For us, as I told you, our conception, and particularly the CPIM, I can't speak of the others who claim to be Marxist. As far as the CPIM is concerned, we are talking of creating a counter-hegemony. That counter-hegemony, and I am on record, I have stated this earlier, that we believe, CPIM, the class struggle in India stands on 2 feet. One is economic exploitation. The second is social oppression. Unless these 2 feet start moving together, you can't even walk, forget running ahead. They have to be combined. The struggles against social oppression and the struggle against economic exploitation are part of the same class struggle in India. That is the counter-class hegemony that we'll have to build. And that counter-class hegemony today comes not only social oppression, meaning that it also comes along with the combination of the counter-hegemony that needs to be created for the hegemony of the ideas of the ruling classes, and that is the Hindutva element concept. And these have to be combined together, and that is how we have to move forward. So Ambedkarites, our appeal to all of them is to understand that this is the manner in which we approach. If you have anything to say that where we can improve, we are welcome. We'll hear. But the point remains that unless we are able to talk about the economic empowerment of the socially oppressed, no class struggle can move forward. The class hegemony can move forward. And that is the most important aspect, because we've had very, very big leaders, Dalit leaders whom all of us respect, all of us revere today, who crores of people will today even follow their calls and their urgings. But then the status of these sections has not improved much. Why? Economic empowerment. That has not been achieved yet. We'll have to struggle together for that. That's our appeal to them. We think all of us have to be, we are part of the much larger struggle together. And that has to be done. Hindutva has to be defeated. Social oppression has to be defeated. And the class struggle has to advance.
Thank you, Comrade Sitaram. In this regard, Leftward brought out a very good, interesting book by, with an detailed introduction of Anand Teltumudi, Ambedkar and Communism, where he dealt in detail how to both the streams has to be merged or synchronized. So those who
Well,
are
there are many
can-
problems and issues with that introduction also. That's a different matter.
Yeah, but still,
But the
still there
objective
are
is there.
there is some
Objective is there.
information. So
Yeah.
who wants
Yeah.
to have a look at it, they can
Yeah,
get
yeah,
it from
surely.
left forward.
Surely.
Now is your turn, Comrade Vijay. How to compare the earlier writing references of on India in Marx writings and the latter references on India? That's the essence of the question.
Let me just begin by saying that Anand Tetlunde is in prison unjustly, and one more political prisoner in India who we hope will be released. He is a leftward author. I edited his book for us. It's a great tragedy for us that a man of his capacity and brilliance is sitting in prison today for no reason. He is a political prisoner, and his release is absolutely important. Ambedkar wrote a lot about how you can't advance the communist movement in India without smashing caste. And I just like to point out that it's important for people to follow the activities and join the activities of the Dalit Shosan Mukti Manch, which is a platform of anti-caste struggle in India. And I think there's no possibility of smashing caste unless one is actually acting against it. Vicious social system. Okay, let's go back to caste actually, because in 1853, when Marx wrote that essay on India, in fact, he writes pretty with feeling about the wretchedness of some of the social systems, including caste. That's the only time I have seen him write with that kind of feeling. And in that text itself, which gets criticized as if Marx is for colonialism, in that very text, he writes about how the Indians are going to overthrow colonialism. Now, that comes 4 years before the Great Rebellion of 1857. That text is written 4 years before the rebellion of 1857, when Marx and Engels basically are for the rebellion. And if you look at his contemporaries at the time, he is miles away from his contemporaries in his support of the Indian people's struggles. I've often been puzzled by the reaction, including by Edward Said, very glib writing on Marx in the 1850s. When, if you compare him to his contemporaries, he's miles ahead. And as I said, during the uprising, he essentially supports the uprising. What's interesting about the later notes that Marx makes, the Kovalevsky notes, which, Lawrence Crader had published in the 1970s. I mean, I remember going through that stuff in the, as a young person, long time ago. This has been around for a long time. I think it was the early 70s that Crader published this work, much before Edward Said published Orientalism. So the work was available there. And then Irfan Habib has been writing about these themes again for about 40 some years, about Marx's writings on India, again, highly neglected. Irfan Habib is one of the most important historians alive today, not only on India, but on Marxism, and is not really paid much attention to by the North Atlantic Academy, which sets the terms for some of these debates, which is a pity, because I think Comrade Irfan is far ahead of them on his assessment of many of these things. Irfan in 1963, in his book on the agrarian system in Mughal India, already talked about how, this idea of a kind of analogy with feudalism, analogizing feudalism globally is an error. One has to look at the concrete conditions in Indian history and so on. Also, Irfan was writing at the time in the 60s about how the concept Asiatic mode of production was merely a heuristic device, and it was totally underdeveloped. It's not a developed concept in Marx. It was used as if it was a well-developed theory and so on. But many people, whether it's Hamza Alawi in Pakistan, Samir Amin, in Egypt. Many people were trying to figure out, with concepts like the tributary mode of production and so on, many people were trying to figure out, is there a different way to theorize our pasts? The pasts of Northern Africa or the pasts of South Asia. I mean, Hamza's work, and by the way, his professional job was at the central bank in Pakistan for most of his career, but one of the most gifted Marxists in Pakistan. Hamza's work was basically about this, which is, can we interpret the past, in ways that are not derivative of a idea of European history? And I think that's pretty interesting. And it's not it's not like we invented it now. This has been a debate for a long time, but again, highly ignored debate. It's a wonder that, again, that Irfan's writings on all this are not better known, and don't set an agenda anywhere in these discussions, in which they should.
Thank you, comrade. Yeah, that's why I called you as voice of the South. Before I think we can end this with the last question from Senthil Kumar.
Good evening, comrade. Yeah, this is Senthil here.
Yep.
Yeah, my question to Marcello is actually one of the theory of Marx is the on labor theory of value, actually on surplus value, like that. It was written in 1868. So is that value still hold good? That theory, that concept is still relevant in this present world, because a lot of things have changed since Marx has written, actually, in terms of how industry is working, how companies are working, in terms of marketing, advertising, branding. So many things have come. Does this still, that concept of surplus value still holds good? That is the question number one. And question number two is, like as Vijay was saying, like Kerala is one model which we can look into India for the communist state. Like that, in the world, in which country do you think which is very closest to what socialism or communism, which was envisioned by Marx, we can say that that country is following that, actually? These are two questions. Thank you.
I will try to be very, very short, because we are already more than 20 minutes after the meeting and we all have other commitments. I wanted to thank you. These are two very good questions. I promise that this will be also the center of my next talk for you, the First International, because we will, of course, discuss this. So the surplus value, the theory of surplus value, is actually something that Marx already started to develop in the Grundrisse. It's already something that he has been working at the end of the 50s, and of course is refining even more and better with the volumes that I mentioned at the beginning, edited by Kautsky, and then the very brilliant chapters in Capital. If I have to answer to this question very quickly, I will say yes. It is still valuable, it is still central to understand our society, but of course, there are many changes and many reasons why we should update many of these things written by Marx 150 years ago. And this, as it has been said by Comrade Sitaram Yechuri, this is our responsibility today, right? So this is, I think, an approach that we can have on this meeting and that we can all share, that we look at Marx like an essential source to understand capitalism and to build anti-capitalism. But at the same time, we want to continue Marx, not because we want to go post-Marx, beyond Marx, etc., because we understand that in order to continue what Marx wanted to do, in order to actually do what he was doing at the end of his life, expanding his analysis, we must do this. And this is, of course, a collective task. Well, today, where I see Marxism and socialism, today we live in a very dramatic age of defeats and problems. So I say that, and who better than me in this discussion can represent this, at least in a geographical position. I was born in Italy, and Italy had the biggest communist party in the Western Europe, and today we don't even have a single party. There are many small ones, and none of them reaches 1%. The communist left is very, very weak. The radical left is very, very weak in Italy and in Europe, with very few exceptions. So I am not looking at today like, you know, an example of state, an example of this, but I'm looking at this plurality of experiences, not only in terms of political parties, but also in terms of social movements. And I'm looking at the difficulties of interacting with the new generation. So this is a task that we have. And from this point of view, if I can finish this talk with the task that I see, that is something that we have to address. We have to make sure that the new generation of activists, of students, of militants, they can read Marx. They can read this new Marx, this more critical Marx, this more open Marx. And we have to make sure that we can provide good anthologies that are a little bit different from the dogmatic textbook that were produced for a long time in Soviet Union or other places. So it is true that the ethnological notebooks, that the studies on anthropology, or the letter to Russians that Marx wrote at the end of his life, have been available for a long time. And I agree what Vijay said. It is responsibility of the scholars had made a ridiculous sometimes portrait of Marx, but at the same time it is difficult to read with Marx, because, you know, the last years of Marx, he's writing very big notes, made sometimes of hundreds of pages. So something that we have to do, and it is very good that each of us is also, the three speakers are also busy and are working with publishing houses, publishing project, book series, because what we want to do is to produce a new not only understanding of Marx, but also of Marxism, of new tendencies for young people, for a new generation. And very soon, I think that we have to address this question. And I think it is useful to have new anthologies, one around alienation, one around ecology, one around migration, in which we can say what Marx actually wrote about this. And then with good introductions, with collective contribution, we can also say, what can we do in order to correct something, or in order to see the changes that happen in our society? This in relation to labor value, it has been said, but also to many other topics. Thank you.
Thank you, Marcello, and thank you, Comrade Sitaram. Thank you, Vijay. We paid a befitting tribute to Karl Marx, Comrade Karl Marx, on this day with this discussion. And I do request all the participants, the formal one, to subscribe to Manchi Pustakam YouTube channel, so that making ourselves and yourself in the part of building or constructing a counter-hegemony, as what Comrade Sitaram called for. Thank you, friends. Thank you.
Thank you.